The plantation owners didn't recognize her at first when the riders appeared that humid Georgia night. They couldn't connect the frightened 14-year-old girl they'd sold for $400 to the woman now sitting tall on horseback, rifle across her lap, leading 20 armed men toward their gates. By the time recognition flickered in their eyes, it was already too late. The girl they'd broken and sold had returned unbroken, and she'd brought an army with her. But how does a child sold on an auction block transform into a warrior who would make her former masters flee into the swamps? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Mary Ellis stood on the auction block in Savannah, Georgia, on a scorching afternoon in 1853. Her bare feet burning on sun-heated wood while white men circled below like vultures assessing carrion. She was 14 years old, small for her age, with quick, intelligent eyes that she'd learned to keep downcast because looking directly at white folks earned you a beating or worse. Her mother, Rachel, had been sold off 3 weeks earlier to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, dragged away screaming while Mary watched helplessly from the slave quarters. Her father had been sold when she was 7, sent to the cotton fields of Mississippi, and she barely remembered his face now except in dreams that came less and less frequently. Her younger brother Joseph, only 9 years old, had been purchased by a tobacco farmer from Virginia just yesterday, and Mary had held him as he sobbed, promising him things she knew were lies, telling him they'd find each other again someday when she had no idea if she'd even survive the week. The auctioneer, a thick-necked man named Carlton Webb who smelled of whiskey and sweat, grabbed Mary's chin roughly and turned her head from side to side, displaying her to the crowd like she was livestock, which in the eyes of the law and these gathered buyers she was. He forced open her mouth to show her teeth, commented loudly on their soundness, mentioned that she was young enough to bear many children, strong enough for field work despite her size, and biddable based on the seller's account, though Carlton knew as well as anyone that enslaved people learned to hide their true spirits deep where their oppressors couldn't reach. The bidding started at $200, and Mary felt each raised bid like a physical blow, each increase in her price a measurement of how thoroughly she'd been reduced from a human being with thoughts and dreams and fears into property that could be bought and traded and used up. A lean man with cold gray eyes and a scar across his left cheek kept raising his paddle, outbidding a farmer who wanted Mary for domestic work, outbidding a merchant who probably wanted her for his house, outbidding everyone who seemed like they might offer even a slim chance at a slightly less brutal existence. This man, who Mary would later learn was named Duncan Cartwright, owned a coastal rice plantation in South Carolina, and he needed workers who could survive the brutal conditions of the lowland fields where malaria and exhaustion killed laborers regularly. When he bid $400, the other bidders fell silent, and the auctioneer's hammer came down with a crack that seemed to seal Mary's fate as completely as a coffin lid closing. Duncan Cartwright paid in cash, counted out the bills right there, and Mary was led down from the block in chains, away from the only city she'd ever known, away from any remaining threads connecting her to her scattered family, into a wagon that would carry her to a hell she couldn't yet imagine. The journey to Cartwright's plantation took 4 days, and Mary spent them chained in the back of a wagon with 6 other newly purchased people, all of them silent with shock or grief or the grim acceptance that came from having survived the slave trade before. An older woman named Ruth, maybe 40 years old, though hard living made age difficult to guess, had kind eyes and shared her meager food ration with Mary when the girl was too heartbroken to eat. Ruth had been sold 5 times in her life, separated from 3 children and 2 husbands, and she'd developed a hard shell of survival that let her endure what would break others. She whispered to Mary during the nights when their captors were asleep, told her the rules for staying alive in rice country, warned her about the diseases that spread through the slave quarters, taught her which overseers to avoid completely and which ones might be momentarily distracted enough to show a flicker of humanity. Cartwright's plantation, called Marshfield, sprawled across 2,000 acres of coastal lowlands where rice grew in flooded fields that bred mosquitoes and disease. The main house sat on slightly higher ground, a grand white columned structure that seemed to mock the misery of the slave quarters visible in the distance. Rows of crude wooden cabins with dirt floors and leaking roofs, where 60 enslaved people lived in conditions barely fit for animals. Mary was assigned to a cabin with 8 other women and girls, given a thin blanket and a bowl, told she'd work the rice fields starting at dawn the next day, warned that laziness or disobedience earned whippings or worse. That first night, Mary lay on the hard floor listening to the other women breathe and cry softly and pray under their breath, and she made herself a promise in the darkness. She would survive this. Somehow, some way, she would not let them break her spirit completely, even if they broke her body. She would remember who she was, remember her mother's face, remember that she was human and valuable and worthy of freedom, even if the entire world told her otherwise. The work in the rice fields was backbreaking in ways Mary's young body wasn't prepared for. She waded in water up to her knees for hours, planting rice shoots in neat rows under the brutal Carolina sun, her hands cut and bleeding from the sharp stems, her back screaming from bending over constantly, her legs developing sores from the filthy water that never healed properly. The overseers, white men hired by Cartwright to extract maximum labor from his human property, rode through the fields on horseback carrying whips they used liberally on anyone who slowed down or straightened up to rest their backs or showed any sign of defiance. Mary learned quickly to keep her head down and her hands moving, to hide the hatred burning in her chest, to file away every detail of cruelty and injustice in her memory where it hardened into something like steel. But Mary also learned other things during those brutal first months at Marshfield. She learned by watching and listening carefully that some of the enslaved people at the plantation had skills beyond field work, that there were hierarchies and relationships and networks of mutual support that existed beneath the surface of their oppression. She learned that information traveled through the slave quarters faster than through the main house sometimes, that news of escapes and rebellions and safe routes north passed from plantation to plantation through a grapevine that slaveholders never fully understood or controlled. She learned that Ruth, the older woman from the wagon, had connections to coastal fishermen who were free black people or sympathetic whites who sometimes helped runaways. She learned that survival meant not just enduring but staying alert, building relationships, gathering knowledge that might someday become useful. Mary turned 15 in the rice fields with no celebration or acknowledgement, then 16 watching other young women around her get pregnant by overseers or Cartwright himself, watching them give birth and have their babies sold away, watching the light die in their eyes a little more each time. She saw people whipped until their backs were hamburger meat for infractions as small as talking back or as imagined as an overseer's paranoid suspicion. She saw an older man named Abel hanged from a tree for trying to run, his body left swinging for 3 days as a warning to everyone else about the price of seeking freedom. She developed dysentery twice and malaria 3 times, fevers that should have killed her but somehow didn't, leaving her weakened but alive when others died in their sleep and were buried in unmarked graves beyond the fields. Through it all, Mary watched and learned and quietly began to organize. She had a gift for reading people, for knowing who could be trusted and who would sell you out for an extra ration of food, for understanding the invisible currents of power and resistance that ran through the enslaved community. She started small, just helping people share resources, making sure someone sick got a little extra food, warning someone when an overseer was in a particularly violent mood, creating tiny acts of solidarity that helped people survive day by day. Other enslaved people began to see her as someone reliable, someone smart, someone who might have answers or at least comfort when everything seemed hopeless. Ruth became like a second mother to her, teaching her everything the older woman knew about survival and resistance and the underground networks that existed to help people escape. In the summer of 1856, when Mary was 17, a young man named Josiah arrived at Marshfield, purchased from a failing plantation further inland. He was 20 years old, tall and strong and angry in a way he tried to hide. But Mary recognized instantly because she carried the same anger in her own chest. Josiah had tried to escape twice before and been caught both times, sold to progressively harsher masters as punishment. And he bore scars from whippings that told stories of rebellion and survival. Mary and Josiah began talking carefully in the evenings when work was done, sharing their hatred of their captivity, sharing information about routes north and sympathetic people and the possibility of freedom that seemed impossible, but refused to die completely. Over months, their cautious friendship deepened into something more, a connection built on shared trauma and shared dreams of escape, and they began planning in earnest. Ruth connected them with a free black fisherman named Isaiah who sometimes came to the plantation to sell his catch, a man who was part of the loose network helping enslaved people escape north. Isaiah explained that the route was dangerous, that most people who tried to run were caught and returned to worse situations than they'd left, but that some made it, that freedom was real even if getting there required risking everything. He told them about safe houses run by Quakers and other abolitionists, about conductors on what people were starting to call the Underground Railroad, about communities of free black people in the North who would help them start over. The information was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, the possibility of freedom dancing just out of reach like a candle flame in darkness. But before Mary and Josiah could attempt escape together, Cartwright sold Josiah to a plantation in Georgia. Needing cash to cover gambling debts and choosing to dispose of the young man he'd heard whispers about, the one some enslaved people looked to as a potential leader of resistance. Mary watched Josiah being led away in chains and felt something crack inside her chest. Another connection severed, another person torn from her life by the brutal machinery of slavery. Josiah tried to fight, struggled against his chains, called her name, and the overseers beat him until he was silent and bloody. Mary stood frozen, hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms, memorizing the scene, adding it to the catalog of injuries and injustices she carried, letting it fuel the cold rage that would eventually give her strength to do impossible things. After Josiah was gone, Mary doubled down on her quiet organizing. She worked with Ruth and Isaiah to help 3 other enslaved people from Marshfield escape over the next year, providing information, gathering supplies, creating distractions when needed. Not every attempt succeeded, and the failures were devastating, but the successes proved that escape was possible, that the system of slavery wasn't as absolute as it pretended to be. Mary learned from each attempt, refined her understanding of what worked and what didn't, built relationships with more members of the underground network. She was 18 years old and had spent 4 years at Marshfield, had survived things that killed other people, had developed a reputation among both enslaved people and even some whites as someone intelligent and capable, which made her useful enough to keep alive but not valuable enough to watch too closely. In the spring of 1858, Mary finally made her own attempt at freedom. Ruth had grown sick with pneumonia, was dying by inches in the drafty slave cabin, and with her last breaths, she told Mary to run, to not waste the knowledge and connections they'd built, to go north and live the life of freedom Ruth would never see. Isaiah the fisherman had arranged passage on a boat for 2 people that would head up the coast under cover of darkness, and Mary convinced another young woman named Grace to come with her, a girl of 16 who was pregnant by an overseer and terrified of what would happen when she gave birth. They slipped away from Marshfield on a moonless night in April, wading through swamps and marshes they'd spent years learning, reaching the hidden cove where Isaiah waited with a small fishing boat that looked like it would fall apart in any serious waves but represented their only chance at escape. The journey north was a nightmare of close calls and constant fear. Isaiah sailed them up the coast at night, hiding them under nets and tarps during the day when other boats passed, landing them at safe houses run by sympathetic people who risked their own freedom and lives to help runaways. Mary and Grace moved from house to house, barn to barn, traveling mostly at night, following the North Star, surviving on determination and the kindness of strangers who believed slavery was evil and worth resisting. Grace went into labor at a Quaker farm in Delaware, gave birth to a baby girl with the help of a white woman who cried while she cut the umbilical cord, and Mary held her friend's hand and promised they'd both stay free, that this baby would grow up never knowing the chains that had bound her mother. They reached Philadelphia in June of 1858, and Mary tasted freedom for the first time in her life at 19 years old. The city was overwhelming, crowded with more people than she'd ever seen, including communities of free black people who had built lives and businesses and families in the North. A Quaker couple connected them with a boarding house run by a formerly enslaved woman named Harriet Douglas, who took in runaways and helped them find work and adjust to freedom. Mary got a job as a seamstress, learned to read and write with the help of abolitionists who ran secret schools, began to build a new life while constantly looking over her shoulder for slave catchers who came north to drag people back to bondage. But Mary couldn't fully settle into her new life because she was haunted by everyone still trapped in slavery. She thought about Josiah, wondered if he was still alive somewhere in Georgia. She thought about her mother Rachel, her brother Joseph, her father whose face she could barely remember. She thought about the people still suffering at Marshfield and plantations like it, still waiting in rice fields, still being beaten and sold and worked to death. The guilt of being free while others remained enslaved ate at her, and she began attending meetings of abolitionists, listening to speakers who talked about resistance and roots north and the moral imperative to help others escape. Within a year of reaching Philadelphia, Mary had joined the work of helping other runaways. She used her knowledge of the Carolina coast, her connections to Isaiah and other underground conductors, her gift for organization, and her calm presence under pressure. She went back south 3 times in 1859, helping small groups of people escape, learning the routes and safe houses, developing a reputation among Underground Railroad conductors as someone reliable and fearless. The work was incredibly dangerous, and Mary knew she could be caught and killed or dragged back to slavery at any moment. But she also knew she couldn't live freely while others remained in chains, couldn't enjoy her own liberation without working toward liberation for everyone. Grace, her friend who had escaped with her, had married a free black carpenter and settled into a peaceful life in Philadelphia, and she begged Mary to stop taking such risks, to settle down and live the quiet, free life they'd fought so hard to reach. But Mary couldn't stop. She'd seen too much, lost too much, carried too much rage and grief to sit still. She began training other formerly enslaved people who wanted to become conductors, teaching them what she knew about moving unseen through hostile territory, about reading people and situations, about staying calm when everything went wrong. By 1860, at age 21, Mary Ellis had helped 47 people escape slavery and had become known in Underground Railroad networks as someone who could handle difficult rescues. The Civil War started in April of 1861, and everything changed. The conflict was about slavery, no matter what Southern politicians claimed, and Mary saw the war as an opportunity to accelerate liberation. She traveled to Port Royal in South Carolina after Union forces captured the area, worked with the military helping coordinate the contraband camps where formerly enslaved people flooded in seeking freedom. She met other black activists and abolitionists who were organizing armed resistance, who believed that enslaved people should be fighting for their own freedom rather than waiting for white Northerners to grant it. The idea resonated with everything Mary believed, and she began actively recruiting and training people who wanted to take direct action. By 1863, Mary was working with a network of formerly enslaved men and women who conducted armed raids on plantations, liberating enslaved people and burning slaveholders' property. They operated mostly along the Carolina and Georgia coast, areas Mary knew intimately from her years at Marshfield. The raids were incredibly dangerous, and several people in Mary's group were killed by Confederate militias or captured and executed. But they also succeeded in freeing hundreds of people and striking fear into plantation owners who had thought themselves invincible. Mary was 24 years old, had spent a decade away from the plantation where she'd been sold for $400 and had transformed from a frightened girl into a hardened leader who commanded respect from men twice her age. She thought about Marshfield constantly, about the people still trapped there, about Duncan Cartwright who had purchased her like livestock and worked her like an animal. She gathered intelligence about the plantation, learned that Cartwright had expanded his operations during the war, was making money selling rice to the Confederacy, had recently purchased 30 more enslaved people to replace the ones who had run or died. The thought of him profiting from the war that was supposedly about ending slavery made Mary's blood boil, and she began planning something audacious. She would go back to Marshfield, would return to the very plantation where she'd spent 4 years in bondage, would free every enslaved person there and make Cartwright pay for his crimes. Her fellow raiders thought she was crazy, that targeting Marshfield was too personal and therefore too dangerous, that she was letting emotion cloud her judgment. But Mary insisted, and she was their leader, so they followed her. She spent months planning the raid, gathering information from runaways who had recently escaped the plantation, mapping out the buildings and guard rotations, coordinating with Union officers who controlled parts of the coastal area. She recruited 20 armed men, mostly formerly enslaved people who had reasons of their own for wanting to strike back at the system that had oppressed them. She trained them carefully, made sure they understood that the goal was liberation, not revenge, that they would free the enslaved people and destroy property but would not become murderers themselves unless absolutely necessary for survival. In July of 1863, on a humid night when the moon was hidden behind clouds, Mary Ellis led her band of armed liberators toward Marshfield Plantation. She rode at the front on a stolen horse, a rifle across her lap, her heart pounding but her hands steady. The $400 girl was returning to the place that had tried to break her, but she was returning unbroken and bringing an army with her. They approached the plantation from the riverside, moving quietly through the marshes Mary had waded through as an enslaved girl, reaching the slave quarters just before midnight. Mary dismounted and walked to the first cabin, knocked on the door in a pattern Isaiah had taught her years ago, and when a frightened woman opened the door, Mary said quietly, "We've come to take you home. We've come to take you north." The woman stared at her, confused and disbelieving, and then recognition slowly dawned. "Mary? Mary Ellis? They said you died. They said runaways always die." Mary smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "They lie about everything. Get your people ready to move. We're leaving tonight, and we're burning this place to the ground on our way out." Word spread through the slave quarters like wildfire, and within an hour, all 62 enslaved people at Marshfield had gathered their few possessions and were ready to leave. The white overseers who slept in a building near the main house heard the commotion and came out to investigate, and Mary's armed men surrounded them efficiently, disarmed them, tied them up without firing a shot. Duncan Cartwright heard noise from the main house and came out onto his grand porch in his nightclothes, holding a pistol, shouting about thieves and rebellion and consequences. Mary walked toward the house slowly, rifle held loosely in one hand, and Cartwright's eyes went wide as he recognized her. "You," he said, his voice strangled with disbelief. "The Ellis girl. The one who ran." Mary stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at the man who had owned her, who had treated her like an animal, who had gotten rich off her labor and suffering. "My name is Mary Ellis," she said clearly, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I was 14 years old when you paid $400 for me in Savannah. You worked me in your rice fields for 4 years. You fed me slop and housed me in a shack and whipped me when I was too sick to work fast enough. You thought you could own me. You thought you could break me." Cartwright raised his pistol with shaking hands, but Mary was faster. She aimed her rifle at his chest and said quietly, "Drop it, or I'll drop you." The old slaveholder hesitated, looked around at the armed men surrounding his property, at the enslaved people watching from the quarters, at the world he'd built on the backs of human suffering coming apart around him. His pistol clattered to the porch floor. "You can't do this," he said desperately. "This is my property. These are my workers. I paid good money. The law is on my side." Mary laughed, and it was a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Your law is dying, Cartwright. Your world is ending, and I'm here to make sure you understand that." She turned to her men and said, "Burn the rice stores. Burn the outbuildings. If he or his overseers try to stop you or follow us, shoot them." Then she looked back at Cartwright and said, "You bought me for $400. Tonight I'm taking back everything you stole, me and everyone else. You're going to watch your plantation burn, and then you're going to run into those swamps you worked us in, and you're going to understand what it feels like to be hunted." 2 of Mary's men dragged Cartwright off the porch and started marching him toward the marshes while his house began to smoke behind them, while flames licked up the sides of the building that had stood as a monument to his wealth and power. Mary organized the formerly enslaved people into groups, assigned her men to guide them north through routes she'd spent years learning, made sure the children and elderly had help, distributed food and supplies they'd brought for the journey. A young woman about 14 years old, the same age Mary had been when she arrived at Marshfield, approached her nervously and asked, "Where are we going? What happens to us now?" Mary put a hand on the girl's shoulder and said gently, "North, to freedom, to a life where nobody owns you and nobody can sell you. It won't be easy, but it will be yours." The girl started crying, and Mary held her while she sobbed, while around them the plantation that had caused so much suffering began to burn in earnest, flames climbing into the night sky like a beacon visible for miles. Other plantation owners would see the smoke and understand that the old order was collapsing, that enslaved people were no longer passive victims but active agents of their own liberation, that women like Mary Ellis were returning to the places that had tried to destroy them and burning those places to the ground. The journey north took 3 weeks because they were moving 62 newly freed people, many of them children or elderly or sick from years of brutal labor. Mary's network of safe houses and sympathetic conductors strained under the volume of refugees, but everyone helped because the raid on Marshfield had become legendary. The story spreading through both abolitionist and enslaved communities faster than seemed possible. The $400 girl who had returned as a liberator, the young woman who had led armed men to free her former captors' captives, had become a symbol of resistance and hope. They reached Philadelphia in early August, and Mary helped settle the Marshfield refugees in boarding houses and contraband camps, helped them find work and start navigating freedom. The 14-year-old girl who had cried in Mary's arms, whose name was Rebecca, stayed close to Mary throughout the journey and after, seeming to view her as a combination of protector and role model. Mary saw herself in Rebecca's fierce intelligence and carefully hidden anger, recognized the same fire that had kept her alive through impossible circumstances. She began training Rebecca and several other young women who wanted to become conductors themselves, who wanted to help free more people, who refused to rest while slavery still existed. The Civil War ground on through 1864 and into 1865, and Mary continued her work, conducting raids and rescues throughout the South, helping hundreds more people escape to freedom. She was wounded twice, once by a bullet that grazed her shoulder during a firefight with slave catchers, once by a knife during a close-quarters struggle with a plantation overseer who tried to stop a rescue. Both times she kept working after minimal recovery, driven by the knowledge that every day she rested was another day people remained in bondage. Her reputation grew until both abolitionists and slaveholders knew her name, until Mary Ellis was spoken of in the same breath as Harriet Tubman and other legendary figures of the Underground Railroad. In April of 1865, General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and the war officially ended. The 13th Amendment was ratified that December, and slavery was finally legally abolished throughout the United States. Mary was 26 years old and had spent 12 years fighting for freedom. 10 years since her escape from Marshfield, and she felt a complicated mix of triumph and exhaustion and grief for everyone who hadn't survived to see this day. She thought about her mother, Rachel, wondered if she was still alive somewhere, if she knew slavery had ended, if they would ever find each other again in this vast country where families had been so deliberately scattered. She thought about Josiah, the young man who had been sold away before they could escape together, wondered if he had survived the war and where he might be now. Mary stayed in the South after the war because Reconstruction meant newly freed people needed help navigating their freedom, needed education and support and organization to resist the white Southerners who were already working to maintain racial oppression through other means. She helped establish schools for formerly enslaved children and adults, taught reading and writing herself, worked with the Freedmen's Bureau to help people secure land and employment. She married a formerly enslaved man named Daniel Cooper who had fought in the Union Army and shared her commitment to uplifting their community. They settled in Charleston, South Carolina, had 3 children over the next 8 years, and Mary balanced motherhood with her ongoing activism. But she never forgot Marshfield or the people she had freed or the $400 Duncan Cartwright had paid for her as if she were livestock. She learned that Cartwright had died in 1867, bankrupt and broken, his plantation never rebuilt after her raid, and she felt a grim satisfaction but no real joy because his death didn't undo the suffering he'd caused or bring back the people he'd worked to death. She learned that several of the people she'd freed from Marshfield had also died, some during the journey north, some from diseases their bodies couldn't fight after years of abuse, some from violence by white Southerners who resented their freedom. But many had survived and built lives. Rebecca, the young woman who had attached herself to Mary during the escape, became a teacher and opened a school for black children in Georgia. Others had become farmers on land they owned themselves, or artisans or activists working for civil rights. The 62 people freed from Marshfield scattered across the country, but many stayed in touch, writing letters to Mary, visiting when they could, creating a kind of extended family bound by shared trauma and shared triumph. Every year on the anniversary of the raid, some of them gathered to remember, to tell stories about that night when a young woman had returned to the place of her enslavement with an army at her back and set everyone free. Mary lived until 1912, dying at age 73, surrounded by her children and grandchildren in the house she and Daniel had built in Charleston. She had lived to see the brief promise of Reconstruction give way to Jim Crow segregation, had fought against the new systems of oppression that replaced slavery, had worked tirelessly for voting rights and education and economic opportunity for black Southerners. She had never stopped being a warrior for justice, never stopped organizing and teaching and fighting, never let the world forget the price of freedom or the ongoing work required to make freedom real. Her obituary in the local black newspaper mentioned that she had been sold for $400 on a Savannah auction block at age 14, that she had escaped slavery, that she had returned to free others, that she had lived a life of service and resistance. But the full story of Mary Ellis was too large for any obituary, too complex for any single telling. She had been a child torn from her family, an enslaved girl worked nearly to death, a runaway who risked everything for freedom, a conductor who led hundreds to safety, an armed liberator who struck back at the system that tried to break her, a wife and mother, a teacher and activist, a woman who refused to accept the limitations others tried to place on her humanity. The $400 Duncan Cartwright paid for Mary Ellis in 1853 was supposed to buy him a lifetime of her labor, was supposed to reduce her to property he could use and discard as he saw fit. Instead, it bought him a reckoning. It bought him the moment when the girl he'd owned returned as a woman he could not control, when his plantation burned and his slaves walked free and he fled into the swamps, understanding finally that human beings cannot truly be owned no matter what the law says, that the spirit can survive attempts to break it, that justice has a way of arriving even when it seems impossible. Mary's story spread through black communities in the South and North, passed down through generations as an example of courage and resistance. Her children told their children, who told their children, keeping alive the memory of a woman who had been sold as a girl and had come back as a force of liberation. Historians would later struggle to verify all the details, to separate fact from legend, to document the exact number of people she had helped free or the precise locations of her raids. But the core truth remained undeniable and powerful. A child sold for $400 had refused to stay sold, had escaped and survived and returned to free others, had transformed personal suffering into collective liberation, had proven that no amount of money could contain the human desire for freedom. In the decades after her death, as the civil rights movement of the 20th century fought battles Mary would have recognized, activists drew inspiration from stories of people like her who had resisted slavery through direct action and armed resistance. The idea that enslaved people had been passive victims waiting for white saviors to free them was a comforting lie that made white people feel better about their history. The truth was messier and more inspiring. The truth was women like Mary Ellis, who organized quietly, who gathered resources patiently, who struck when the moment was right, who understood that freedom was something you took rather than something you were given. The plantation where Mary had been enslaved was never rebuilt after she burned it. The land eventually grew wild, rice fields reverting to marshland, buildings collapsing into ruins, nature reclaiming what human cruelty had corrupted. By the late 20th century, historians had identified the location and conducted archaeological surveys, finding artifacts that told stories of the people who had lived and worked and suffered there. They found the foundations of the slave cabins where Mary had slept on dirt floors, found tools used in the rice fields, found evidence of the fire that had consumed the plantation in 1863. The site became part of a heritage project documenting slavery's history. And Mary Ellis's story was featured prominently in the interpretive materials for visitors who came to understand what had happened there. But perhaps the most fitting monument to Mary's life was not a historic site or a museum exhibit, but the generations of descendants from the people she had freed, families who existed because she had helped their ancestors escape bondage, children who grew up free because a young woman had refused to accept her own enslavement as final. The ripple effects of her actions spread through time in ways that could never be fully calculated or documented. Every person she had helped free had gone on to live lives, have children, make choices that shaped the future. The liberation she had offered was not just a one-time event, but an ongoing gift that kept giving through generations. Rebecca, the young woman who had looked to Mary as a mentor, lived until 1928 and spent her life teaching and organizing. She wrote a memoir in 1905 that included detailed accounts of the Marshfield raid and Mary's leadership, and that memoir became an important primary source for later historians studying slave resistance and the Underground Railroad. In her memoir, Rebecca wrote, "Mary Ellis taught me that survival is not enough, that we must do more than endure, that we must actively work to free ourselves and each other. She showed me that a girl sold for $400 could become a general in the Army of Liberation, that we contain multitudes they can never purchase or control, that our value cannot be measured in their currency because we are priceless." The number 400 became symbolic in stories about Mary, representing both the depths of dehumanization inherent in slavery and the inadequacy of attempting to price human life. $400 was what they said she was worth, but she had proven herself worthless to their system of valuation, priceless in the true sense of the word. She had taken their assessment, their attempt to reduce her to a commodity, and had returned it to them transformed into something they feared. A living demonstration that enslaved people were neither property nor helpless victims, but human beings with agency and power and the capacity to fight back. In the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s, organizers rediscovered stories like Mary's and used them to inspire new generations of activists. The idea that black people had always fought their own battles, had never simply accepted oppression. That resistance had deep historical roots, was empowering for people facing massive resistance to integration and equal rights. Mary Ellis's story was taught in freedom schools, discussed at organizing meetings, invoked in speeches and writings by people who understood that the struggle for liberation was continuous, that each generation had to take up the work the previous generation had advanced. By the 21st century, Mary Ellis had entered the realm of legend, her story told and retold in books and documentaries and academic papers, each telling emphasizing different aspects of her life depending on the teller's interests and the audience's needs. Some focused on her escape and Underground Railroad work, presenting her as a conductor like Harriet Tubman. Others emphasized her armed raids, presenting her as a militant resistor who believed in taking freedom by force. Still others focused on her work during Reconstruction, presenting her as an educator and organizer. All these narratives were true to different aspects of her life, and the fact that she couldn't be reduced to a single story was part of what made her legacy so rich and complex. But perhaps the simplest and most powerful version of her story was the one that started with an auction block in Savannah and ended with a burning plantation and 62 people walking toward freedom. A girl sold for $400, returning as a woman leading an army of liberation, making the people who had tried to own her flee into swamps, proving that the human spirit cannot be purchased or broken no matter how much violence and degradation is brought to bear against it. That story, in all its terrible beauty and hard-won triumph, contained truths about American history that the country was still struggling to fully acknowledge and reckon with generations later. Mary Ellis was 14 years old when she stood on an auction block and was sold as property. She was 24 when she returned to free the people still trapped where she had been enslaved. She was 73 when she died surrounded by family in a house she owned in a city where she lived as a free woman. The arc of her life bent from bondage toward liberation, and she spent every year of her freedom working to extend that liberation to others. She was not a saint, was not perfect, made mistakes, and sometimes let anger guide her decisions, was as human and flawed as anyone. But she was also extraordinary in her courage and determination, in her refusal to accept that the cruelty of slavery was inevitable or permanent, in her transformation of personal trauma into collective action. The $400 paid for her in Savannah in 1853 was supposed to be a transaction, a simple exchange of money for property in a system where such exchanges were legal and normal and unquestioned by most white Americans. But Mary Ellis turned that transaction into something else, into a debt that could never be repaid, into an injustice that demanded reckoning. She collected on that debt when she freed herself, when she freed others, when she returned with armed men to the plantation where she had suffered and burned it to the ground. She collected on it every day she lived as a free woman, every person she helped escape bondage, every child she taught to read, every speech she gave about the horrors of slavery and the ongoing work of building real freedom. And in the end, that is the story worth remembering. Not just that she was sold, but that she freed herself. Not just that she suffered, but that she fought back. Not just that she escaped, but that she returned to liberate others. Not just that she survived, but that she lived fully and fiercely, refusing to let the evil done to her diminish her humanity or her capacity for hope and action. But there were moments in Mary's journey that revealed the depth of her transformation in ways the broader strokes of her story could not fully capture. In 1859, a year after her escape, Mary had encountered a young white woman in Philadelphia named Catherine Morrison, who worked with the Quaker Abolitionist Network. Catherine was perhaps 25 years old, idealistic and passionate about ending slavery, but she had grown up in comfort and had never experienced the brutality she was fighting against. The two women worked together on several rescues, and Catherine would often ask Mary questions about her time in bondage, questions that revealed a fundamental inability to truly understand what slavery had been like despite her genuine desire to help. One evening, after they had successfully guided a family of 5 to safety, Catherine said to Mary, "I cannot imagine how you endured it. I think I would have given up, would have let despair consume me." Mary had looked at the younger white woman for a long moment before responding, choosing her words carefully because she needed Catherine's help and could not afford to alienate her, but also needing to make something clear. "You say you cannot imagine it," Mary said quietly, "and that is true, you cannot. Because imagining suffering is not the same as surviving it. You have the luxury of imagining that you would give up or that you would fight back or that you would do anything specific because for you it is theoretical. For me, it was wake up or die, work or be beaten to death, endure or be sold to somewhere worse. There was no choice to give up because giving up meant death, and I wanted to live." Catherine had started to cry, apologizing, saying she did not mean to minimize Mary's experience, and Mary had softened slightly, putting a hand on the white woman's shoulder. "I know you mean well," she said, "and I know you are risking things to help us. But understand that we do not need your pity. We need your action. We need you to use your privilege, your whiteness, your freedom of movement to help us be free. That is enough. You do not need to understand our suffering. You just need to help end it." That conversation had stuck with Mary through the years, informing how she worked with white abolitionists who were allies but could never fully be comrades because they had not experienced the particular hell of being treated as property. She learned to work with people whose understanding was limited, to take what help they offered while not depending on them completely, to build networks of formerly enslaved people who understood each other in ways outsiders never could. This political sophistication, this ability to navigate complex alliances while maintaining her own agency and vision, became crucial to her success as a conductor and later as a raid leader. There were also moments of profound doubt that Mary rarely spoke about but carried with her always. In 1861, during her fourth return trip south to conduct rescues, she had led a group of 7 people through the swamps of South Carolina when they were ambushed by slave catchers with dogs. The group scattered in panic, and Mary tried to keep them together, but it was chaos in the darkness. She heard screams, heard gunshots, heard the vicious barking of dogs trained to hunt human beings. She managed to escape with 3 of the people, but 4 others were captured, and she learned later that 2 of them had been killed trying to escape again, while the other 2 had been sold to plantations in the Deep South as punishment. Mary had nightmares about those 4 people for years afterward. She questioned whether she had done something wrong, whether she should have chosen a different route or a different night, whether her decisions had gotten people killed who had trusted her to lead them to freedom. Daniel, her husband, would hold her when she woke gasping from dreams where she heard those screams again, would remind her that she had saved hundreds of people, that the evil of slavery was responsible for those deaths, not her choices. But Mary never fully forgave herself, never stopped carrying the weight of every person she could not save alongside the pride of every person she had freed. These complexities, these moments of alliance and doubt and moral weight, were part of what made Mary's leadership so effective. She was not naively optimistic, did not promise people that escape would be easy or safe, did not minimize the risks they were taking. Instead, she was brutally honest about the dangers while also being absolutely committed to doing everything in her power to get people to freedom. This honesty built trust in ways false promises never could, and people followed her because they knew she understood what they were risking and would not waste their courage on poorly planned attempts. The raid on Marshfield in 1863 had been the culmination of years of this work, but the actual planning and execution revealed Mary's tactical brilliance in ways that the dramatic broad strokes of the story did not fully capture. She had spent 6 months gathering intelligence about the plantation, not just from recent escapees, but also from free black fishermen who sold goods there, from Union soldiers who had scouted the area, from maps she had studied and memorized. She knew exactly how many enslaved people lived there, knew which ones would fight if given the chance and which ones were too broken or scared to take the risk. She knew the names of the overseers, knew their schedules and habits, knew which one drank himself to sleep most nights and which one was alert and dangerous. Mary had also prepared her 20 armed men with military precision. She drilled them on hand signals so they could communicate silently, taught them to move through swamps without making noise, made them practice disarming opponents without firing shots that would alert others. She prepared multiple escape routes in case the primary one was compromised, stashed supplies at intervals along the journey north, coordinated with contacts who would provide safe houses. By the time they approached Marshfield that humid July night, every person in her group knew exactly what they were supposed to do and when, understood the mission parameters, had been trained to handle unexpected complications. The moment when Duncan Cartwright had recognized her on his porch was more complicated than it seemed in simple retellings. Mary had not originally planned to confront him directly, had intended to simply free the enslaved people and leave, burning property but not engaging with the slaveholders personally. But when Cartwright came out with his pistol, something in Mary had snapped. She found herself walking toward him without conscious decision, found herself looking into the face of the man who had owned her, found years of rage and grief bubbling up from depths she usually kept carefully controlled. When she told him he was going to understand what it felt like to be hunted, she meant it with every fiber of her being. 2 of her men, following her unspoken command, had dragged Cartwright into the swamps and left him there, terrified and disoriented, stumbling through water and muck in the darkness while mosquitoes swarmed him, and the sounds of the plantation burning echoed behind him. They did not kill him, did not even beat him. but they gave him a taste of the fear that enslaved people lived with constantly. The sensation of being prey, of having no control, of not knowing if you would survive the night. Cartwright wandered those swamps for 2 days before finding his way to a neighboring plantation, half dead from dehydration and insect bites and terror. He was never the same afterward, people said, was haunted and broken. Died within 4 years, still owing money and crying out in his sleep about the girl who had come back to destroy him. Mary had not felt satisfaction when she learned about his suffering years later. She had felt a kind of grim completion, a sense that some cosmic balance had been partially restored, even though it could never truly be balanced because the dead could not be brought back and the years of suffering could not be undone. Justice, she had learned, was never clean or complete, was always mixed with grief for what had been lost and could not be recovered. The 62 people freed from Marshfield had each carried their own complicated responses to liberation. Some, like Rebecca, had embraced freedom immediately and spent the rest of their lives working to help others. But some struggled deeply with the transition, found that freedom without resources or education or support networks was its own kind of prison. An older man named Joshua, who had been enslaved for 60 years and remembered nothing else, could not adjust to making his own decisions, to not having every hour of his day dictated by an overseer. He had what people today would recognize as severe trauma, flinching at loud noises, unable to sleep in proper beds, compulsively working even when there was no work to be done. Mary and other activists tried to help him, but Joshua never fully recovered, died within 3 years of liberation, still carrying the mental chains slavery had forged. Experiences like Joshua's taught Mary that liberation was not a single moment but a process, that escaping physical bondage was only the first step in a much longer journey towards psychological and economic and social freedom. This understanding shaped her Reconstruction work, her insistence on education and land ownership and economic opportunity for formerly enslaved people. She knew from experience that freedom without resources was hollow, that people needed tools to build new lives, not just the absence of chains. During the Reconstruction years from 1865 through the 1870s, Mary threw herself into community building with the same intensity she had brought to conducting rescues. She helped establish 3 schools in South Carolina, taught in them herself several days a week, focusing particularly on young women because she believed educated women would uplift entire communities. She taught reading and writing and arithmetic, but also history and political organization and practical skills. She wanted her students to understand that education was power, that literacy meant you could read contracts so you could not be cheated, could read newspapers so you could understand politics, could write letters so you could stay connected to scattered family members. One of her students was a girl named Patience, who had been freed at age 8 and had no formal education until Mary's school. Patience proved to be brilliant, learning to read within months, devouring every book she could access, asking questions that showed a penetrating intelligence Mary recognized and nurtured. Mary tutored Patience privately, pushing her to think critically about the world, encouraging her to imagine possibilities beyond what seemed immediately available. Patience eventually became a journalist, one of the first Black women in the South to write for newspapers, and she credited Mary with changing the trajectory of her entire life. But Reconstruction also brought violent white backlash, and Mary witnessed and experienced the terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan and similar groups determined to maintain white supremacy through intimidation and murder. In 1868, one of the schools Mary had helped establish was burned by night riders, and the teacher, a young Black man named Frederick who had fought in the Union Army, was beaten so severely he never fully recovered. Mary organized armed guards for the remaining schools, worked with other activists to create networks of mutual protection, attended meetings where they strategized about how to respond to white violence. During one particularly tense period in 1870, when Klan activity had escalated dramatically, a group of white men came to Mary's house in Charleston while Daniel was away, intending to intimidate her into stopping her activism. They pounded on her door after midnight, shouted threats, fired shots into the air. Mary, alone with her two young children sleeping in the next room, had calmly loaded the rifle she kept near her bed, walked to a window and fired a shot that took the hat off one of the men's heads. "The next one goes lower," she called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I have more bullets than you have patience, and I am a much better shot than you want to test. Leave now, or learn what happens when you threaten a woman who has survived worse than you." The men had left, cursing and threatening retribution, but they never came back to her house specifically, though Klan violence continued throughout the region. Daniel, when he returned and learned what had happened, had been shaken but not surprised. He knew the woman he had married, knew she would not be intimidated, knew her courage was rooted in years of surviving and resisting horrors most people could not imagine. They discussed moving north where it might be safer, but Mary refused. "I did not survive slavery and risk my life freeing others just to run from racist terrorists," she said firmly. "This is my home. This is where the work needs doing. If they want me gone, they will have to kill me, and I promise you I will take some of them with me." This fierce determination, this refusal to be moved or silenced, characterized Mary's entire approach to Reconstruction activism. She worked with the Freedmen's Bureau when their goals aligned, pushed back against their paternalism when it did not. She campaigned for Republican candidates who supported black civil rights, organized voter registration drives, taught people about their political rights and how to exercise them. When black men gained the right to vote during Reconstruction, Mary organized groups of women to educate voters about candidates and issues, finding ways to participate in politics despite being excluded from formal voting themselves. She also maintained connections with the underground network she had built during the slavery era, because escaping slavery did not end with the Civil War. Slavery continued in various forms. Children were kidnapped and sold into forced labor. People were arrested on false charges and leased to plantations through the convict lease system that was slavery by another name. Mary helped coordinate rescues of people trapped in these systems, helped families locate and retrieve kidnapped children, continued her work as a liberator even after slavery was legally abolished, because she understood that legal changes did not automatically translate into real freedom. In 1873, Mary learned through her networks that Josiah, the young man she had loved at Marshfield who had been sold away before they could escape together, was alive and living in Atlanta. She had thought about him periodically over the years, wondered what had happened to him, carried a complicated mix of grief and guilt about their truncated relationship. When she learned he had survived the war and had married and was working as a carpenter, she felt joy mixed with an old ache of loss. She wrote him a letter, the first communication between them in 15 years, and he wrote back immediately. They corresponded regularly after that, sharing their stories of survival and resistance, comparing notes about Reconstruction politics and organizing work. Josiah had become an activist himself, was helping build black economic institutions in Atlanta, was working against the sharecropping system that trapped formerly enslaved people in debt peonage. They never saw each other in person again, geographical distance and family obligations keeping them in their respective cities. But their friendship through letters became important to both of them, a connection to their shared past, and a reminder of how far they had come. Daniel, Mary's husband, was secure enough in their relationship not to be threatened by her correspondence with a former love. He understood that Mary's past had shaped her in ways he could not fully access, that there were experiences and memories and relationships that predated him and would always be part of who she was. His generosity and trust allowed Mary the freedom to maintain connections and friendships that mattered to her, to be a whole person rather than narrowly defined by her role as wife and mother. The 1880s and 90s brought the collapse of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow segregation, and Mary watched gains be rolled back, watched voting rights be stripped away through literacy tests and poll taxes and violence, watched white supremacy reassert itself through new legal mechanisms. The betrayal was devastating. The understanding that the federal government would abandon black Southerners to their former oppressors, that the promise of equality would be deferred for generations. Mary struggled with despair during this period, wondered if all the fighting and sacrifice had been for nothing if white supremacy could simply recreate itself through new systems. But she also saw resilience and resistance in her community, saw people continuing to build institutions and families and economic systems despite the obstacles. She saw her own children growing up with education and opportunities she had never dreamed of as a child, saw students she had taught becoming teachers and business owners and activists themselves. She understood that progress was not linear, that setbacks were inevitable, that the work of building genuine freedom would take generations, not years. This long view, earned through decades of struggle, allowed her to keep fighting even when immediate victories seemed impossible. Mary also became increasingly involved in the Black Women's Club movement that emerged in the late 19th century, joining and helping lead organizations that addressed issues affecting Black women specifically. These clubs did mutual aid work, supported education initiatives, advocated for women's rights, and created spaces where Black women could organize and lead without the interference or paternalism of either white women or Black men. Mary found community and purpose in this work, appreciated the way these organizations centered Black women's experiences and leadership. Through the club movement, Mary met other women with histories similar to hers, women who had survived slavery and spent their freedom fighting for justice, and these friendships sustained her through difficult years. They shared strategies and stories, celebrated each other's victories, mourned each other's losses, created networks of support that were both personal and political. These relationships reminded Mary that she was not alone, that the work she did was part of a broader movement of Black women working for liberation. As Mary aged into her 60s and 70s in the early 1900s, she became a living link to the slavery era for younger generations who had been born free. Young activists sought her out, asked for her stories and her wisdom, wanted to understand how she had survived and resisted. Mary was generous with her time and knowledge, but she was also honest about the costs of resistance, about the trauma that never fully healed, about the ways that surviving horrors changed you permanently. She did not want to romanticize her experiences or create the impression that resistance was easy or glorious. It was necessary and right, but it was also brutal and painful and left scars that lasted lifetimes. In her final years, Mary reflected often on the meaning of her life, on what she had accomplished and what remained undone. She had been sold for $400 and had escaped and had freed hundreds of others and had helped build institutions that would outlast her, and she took pride in those achievements. But she also saw clearly that white supremacy remained powerful, that Black people in the South lived under oppressive conditions that in some ways echoed slavery, that true freedom remained elusive. She died knowing the work was unfinished, hoping the generations coming after her would carry it forward, trusting that the seeds she had planted would bear fruit even if she did not live to see the harvest. Her funeral in Charleston in 1912 drew hundreds of people, including many she had helped free from slavery decades earlier. Students she had taught, activists she had mentored, family members spanning 3 generations. They gathered to honor a woman who had been extraordinary but had also insisted she was simply doing what needed doing, who had transformed personal trauma into collective liberation, who had refused to accept the limitations placed on her by a society that considered her property. They told stories about her courage and her kindness and her fierce determination. Stories that would be passed down through families and communities, becoming part of the collective memory of resistance and survival that sustained Black people through the continuing struggles of the 20th century and beyond.